Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar. I see there are a number of people online. I want to welcome you to tonight's session of the Essential Work of Vermont School Boards webinar presented by the School Boards Association. My name is Harry Frank and I work here as the Associate Director for Board Development and Training. Because we have a small group online tonight, we're going to make this as conversational as possible. You'll notice at this point that you're muted, so when you join the webinar, that's automatically what happens. As we get underway here after my introduction, we're going to try and unmute everybody and see if that works. You can, of course, mute yourself from your own computer, and we'll go over a few more details, including that in a moment. In essence, tonight's session is about the role, broadly speaking, and the specific responsibilities that we believe are critical for good governance. All right, I just want to forward my slide. Okay, so briefly, tonight's webinar will be by way of PowerPoint. As I mentioned, we're going to try to engage you as much as possible. There are two means to participate. One is in writing using the question box. There should be a control panel on your screen that gives you a couple of options. One of them should be called questions. Any comments and or questions you want to send to me, you can do through writing them in that question box. I'll coordinate those. Your other option is by voice, and it looks like everybody online has a microphone, so we'll use that mechanism. Carrie Lamb is here, our operations manager, and she can help orchestrate voice if we need.
Good evening, everyone.
At the end of the session, sorry, I just heard somebody come on.
It was me, Harry. I'm sorry, I was just saying good evening.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Carrie. And I was going to do a round of introductions in just a moment, so I'll give you another chance as well as everybody else. But just to finish the outline here, there'll be an evaluation at the close of the webinar. It's always helpful for us to get some feedback on the session. And then you'll also receive an email that has all the information from tonight's presentation, all the slides included. And finally, you can find all this information after tonight's session archived on our website. So we'll give you a link to that as well. Okay, so let's get to introductions. I said briefly I was here, and Carrie, why don't you start? And then if you could unmute people, and maybe I'll just call on people in order that I have them on the screen. That way we won't have confusion. So go ahead, Carrie, why don't you start?
Okay, so I just started unmuting people, and I was getting feedback right away. So
okay.
What I'll do is if I unmute you and there's feedback, then I'll mute it again quickly, and you can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay, just 1 second, and I'll start unmuting people. Okay.
All right, so let's try this.
When you go as an educator, you kind of do go in a different realm.
If you would introduce yourselves by telling us your name and what board you serve on, and then how long you've been on the board.
I work with,
imagine that most people are new board members, but may have some experience. So I'll, again, just facilitate this and start with Catherine Peltz.
Okay, do I just talk to you?
Yes.
It sounds good so far, so go right ahead.
What am I supposed to tell you? Tell who I am and where I'm from?
Your name and what board you serve on, and then how long you've been on the board.
I serve on the Woodbury Elementary School Board, and I have been on the board over 2 years.
Great.
That's it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Catherine. Erin, I think it's Sterner.
Yep, that's right. I'm Erin Sterner, and I'm on the Thetford School Board in the Orange East Supervisory Union, and I've served for 1 year.
Yeah, that's helpful too, because my guess is people may not know exactly where towns are. So Thetford's in Orange eastern side of the state, and Catherine, Woodbury is a little north central.
Orleans Southwest. And I'm going to back up and just say I signed in with my name, but I never go by Catherine. It's Khaki.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I should have said that, but anyway.
Got it. All right. Jenny Silva.
I am from the Barnard Academy School Board, and I've only been on the board for 4 months.
And where is the Barnard Academy?
It's in Windsor County. It's part of the
Okay.
Windsor County Supervisory Union.
I see. Great. Melissa, are you there? I see you're muted on my...
Sorry, Harry, I had muted her.
No, I usually don't. Just had to go to a Bangkok McDonald's when I first, because there was a lying, Ronald McDonald greeting me. So I was like, oh my God.
Okay, so I just muted her because I don't think she realized that she was unmuted.
All right. Well, we'll come back around to
Okay.
Melissa.
Melissa, if you'd like to unmute yourself later, you can do that.
Shauna Richardson, are you online?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm from Lowell. That's part of the North Country Supervisory Union, and I've been on the board for about 6 months now.
Got it. Got it. And Lowell is northeast Kingdom?
Yeah, it's in Orleans County.
Got it. Okay. And then is it Shuri? Shuri? I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Yep, it's Sherry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's Sherry Mack.
Great. And Shuri, what board do you serve on?
I'm on the Reading Elementary School Board, and
Okay.
I've been on the board for just over a month.
And Reading is central Vermont, you'd say? What's the
We're,
county?
we're actually in the same supervisory union as Barnard. We're in Windsor Central, yeah, supervisory union.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
Great.
All right.
So can I just say, anyone, if you have dogs barking or kids, or you just would rather be muted, at any time you can just click on your microphone and it will mute you.
All right, so we'll try it this way, and there'll be a number of instances where I'll be looking for your input. So your voice channels are open, and again, you can correspond in the question box by typing any comments or questions. All right. Sorry, let's go here. Okay, I think we've done the introductions part. We're going to jump right into a case study. Much of the session tonight is driven by scenarios. So what I'd like to do is take a minute to read this, think to yourself about these questions, and then I'm going to invite people to respond. And we'll try by voice, but again, you can type your thoughts here. So please take a minute to read this through. In about a minute, I'll prompt people to start responding if they haven't already. So my sense is we could jump in here. And there may be people more or less ready, but of course part of the idea here is if this hasn't happened to you already, it is likely to, and of course in a situation like this, well, you can buy time in all sorts of ways, but generally you've got to respond there and then. So can someone jump in, and I'll do my best to get everybody responding here, but what do you say and do in that moment when you're approached in the grocery store by a... Yeah, go ahead.
This is Kaki. I had a recent... Should I just keep talking?
Gary, there's some feedback.
So, Kaki, what you want to do is turn your speakers down when you're speaking. It's similar to when you're on the radio. It's hearing the microphone's hearing your speakers. So
okay,
if you,
is this better?
That's perfect.
Okay. I had an incident recently. I was in the town clerk's office. I won't give any names, but I did have a parent, a town person, ask me some questions about a process that she felt wasn't working for her. She gave me a lot of information about what had happened. I listened, and I guess my first response to her was I thanked her for talking to me about this, but that and I listened, but I didn't answer any of the questions, but gave her the process to follow, which was to make sure that she had voiced her concerns to the principal and to the teacher and to the superintendent, and that those were the channels that she should follow. But most of all, I guess I was a listener at that point and encouraging her to stay involved in the process so that she could get some answers that she didn't think she was getting. Rather than just give up and move out of the school system, which she wanted to do, I said I thought she should continue to meet with the committee that was working with her child's special needs, period.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think it's right on. So I want to summarize a couple points that you've made and then ask if there are other strategies people have used or think would work. But you know, things that you included, you certainly want to have the person feel heard. So listening in the fashion that you know, is giving them that message, and at the same time being clear. It's not a situation that the board is really, or not really, is structured to address, and the place to resolve these issues as ideally at the source of the problem, which would be with the teacher. Should that not be successful or there be obstacles to approaching the teacher, there is what's commonly referred to as a chain of command, a sequence of supervision that's our school system's best device for making sure issues get resolved. So teachers are supervised by the principal. If the parent didn't successfully get in touch with the teacher, or the conversation and meeting was not successful in resolving things, he or she could then appeal to the principal to intervene, to bring a different perspective and process. And in a similar fashion, if the issues weren't resolved there, the superintendent, who serves as the supervisor for the school principals, would be the next step in this chain of command. There is a required policy for boards to have, which is often referred to as a chain of command, or sometimes handling complaints, and it would spell out these steps. It's an important policy for board members to be familiar with for a couple reasons. First and foremost, it's likely that you'll have this kind of encounter during your board service. Second of all, it's a really effective way to convey the role of the board in general terms, which is to say the board doesn't intervene in individual complaints unless, in fact, the sequence of accountability that I was describing doesn't come to a resolution. In other words, if the parent appeals to the teacher, tries to work things through, isn't successful, and proceeds to work with the principal and subsequently the superintendent, and through all of those efforts still has not reached a resolution, then in fact the board would serve as the final level of appeal in this system, in this chain of command. So by directing the parent back to the place where the problem occurred, both you're in reinforcing the way this organization works, let alone kind of reinforcing a respectful and constructive way to resolve issues. And you're also sending a message about what's the board's role here. The board's role is to make sure this system works. And so if it hasn't worked through each of the stages, it would come to us both to resolve the particular issue, but also obviously to be aware that the system wasn't successful, and that's important information for the board to have. So I've wandered through a number of areas that I want to touch on, but I want to check back with those others of you who are listening. Did you have any, to find out whether there are other dimensions that I didn't touch on? So whether it's in that initial interaction or subsequent to that, are there any other additional strategies that you would use, have thought of, that your board has discussed, or that you have questions about?
This is Jenny Silva. I actually do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So after we have this discussion with her, just suppose that she said, I've already spoken with the teacher and didn't get anywhere. Is there a step that we should take?
Well, one of the other than saying, well, the next step would be to approach the principal. Sorry, there's a little noise in the background there for a moment. So certainly one part of your response would be to say the way we've organized our system to make sure things get resolved is to have people supervising each level of our organization, and so the next place to go would be the principal. And again, it's a balance of hearing that person out without getting deeply into the issues and directing them then to the next step. Many boards agree to a process that includes the board member letting the board chair know that they've been approached with this concern, and letting the superintendent know, and in some cases letting the principal know. And it's a little bit of a heads up to let them know that something should be on their radar. It's also a mechanism for recognizing patterns if there are patterns of concern expressed by multiple parents or community members. So that's another step that many boards agree to. I'll say a number of times tonight that what's critical is that the board discusses these kinds of questions and makes a clear decision, and that each member of the board upholds those decisions. So if that's the practice, that if you're approached in the grocery store, you're going to direct the concerned citizen back to the source of the problem, you're also going to let other people in the system know, and it's typically the board chair and the superintendent, and in some cases the principal. So that would be one other dimension of possible response.
Okay.
What else? Any other considerations here? And again, either strategies that you have used or think of using, questions that you have, anything else we haven't touched on?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, okay. This is Sherry Mack. Let me turn my speakers down so I don't get the feedback. My question is, I guess, off of the last question. So the parent has gone to the teacher, gone to the principal, gone to the superintendent, now comes to the board. What role then does the board play?
So the board is referred to as the final board of appeal. The policy that I referred to before, that's alternately called handling complaints or chain of command, will spell out what the actual steps are in a little more detail, and typically it includes the requirement that the complaint be put in writing. Actually, that's usually the case before it goes to the superintendent, but it's certainly the case were it to come to the board. The board typically deals with, and so that it would be put on the agenda for a board meeting, the board typically deals with these situations in executive session because they could be talking about individuals, and so the board would need to make a motion to enter executive session based on a student. I should get the language actually so I can give that. We're going to touch on executive session later on this evening, and one of the things I will say is be very strict about your use of executive session. There's a, and I'll refer to this in a little bit more detail later, but one of the reasons for entering executive session would be discussion or consideration of records or documents, not public documents. I'm looking for the one that talks about students, evaluation of employee. Oh, sorry. So academic records of a student would be the rationale for using executive session, and there the board could hear would basically conduct a hearing, and there's actually guidelines for that hearing in our resource guide. There are a number of times tonight when I'll refer to the publication we call The Essential Work of Vermont School Boards. It's available in a hard copy. It's also available on our website. So I probably won't spend a great deal of time giving you page references, but in the slides that come out after tonight's session, there'll be references to where you can find more information in the book. So the board would hear the case following its own procedures and guidelines and make a decision which would be considered the final decision. They would come out of executive session to take that action, make a motion and take a vote, and that would be the mechanics of managing a complaint should it arrive at the board level. I think there was one other person that was going to add a comment or question.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Kaki. If the parent or community member who has the question about, mostly a parent, who has a complaint or a concern and does not file a complaint or follow that process, but has that conversation possibly with the principal, and I guess I'm getting at a question like, where is it, if we want to learn what stage that possibly that parent's, where that parent is in the stages of filing the complaint, or it's often not the place to have the conversation in the board meeting, but I guess my question is, you can call your board chair and ask if that's something he or she knows about, or you can call your superintendent. But it is in the interests of board members to understand and even be kind of alerted to what's going on. I guess that's, how do we do that without being too snoopy, or we don't need all the details, but we need more information when it becomes a question then in our minds too about what's happening.
Yeah, well, here's an important line. I think it's entirely appropriate for board members to know that situations are resolved. One of the other suggestions we make is a practice that's also common amongst boards, that you say to this parent, let me know. Would you please let me know that you've been able to resolve this issue? That there's a feedback loop you can establish with that person directly. So I think that's a good practice. Short of that, were the board to spend its time getting an update on where each individual complaint or concern that comes through the system might be, would significantly dictate what kind of time you have to do your other work. So much of what I try to do in tonight's session is make the case that you have a lot of really critical work to do, and certainly there's a dimension of this complaint process that's important information for the board to be informed about. I would say that that's when there's a pattern established, either obviously of concern or possibly there's some important update that's of a very positive nature. But were the board to want an update on the status of each individual complaint or concern that might have been authored, would be an enormous drain on your time, and maybe more importantly, a mixed message to the school about faith in the system. If you have concerns that you don't have a responsive system to parental complaints, that's a much bigger issue. I would call that one of those patterns. So short of that, I think you need to share the information, as I discussed, with the board chair and the superintendent, and again, in some cases, boards include the principal in that loop, and expect those people to inform the rest of the board should there be a pattern of concern that's appropriate for the board to be aware of and dig into. So that's my thought on your question. I want to move us along, and you'll notice in the slides that you received that following each of our conversations or case studies, there'll be what I would call a summary slide. So what you see on the screen now is the summary from the handling complaints scenario. And we've touched on all these items, but I want to pull them up here in case there's any further comment. But again, initially, it's a process of listening and, to a certain extent, taking care of people, directing them to follow the policy and procedures that's in place. And that's, again, both for the benefit of the individuals involved, the effective functioning of the system, and the clear message about what the board's role and responsibilities are. I mentioned that being a critical policy to have in place and to be familiar with. Often referred to as the chain of command. And then we touched on these other dimensions about informing the chair and administrator, as well as following up with the complainant if that's something that your leadership team decides is an appropriate step to have. And then, of course, this the underscored message that the board serves as the final level of appeal. And maybe that's another way to reinforce why it's so important not to get engaged in the particulars of a complaint, either at the beginning or at any point through the sequence, because should it come to the board, you'll be asked to make a objective and balanced and thoughtful decision. And it's not to say that I don't think any and probably every board member couldn't hear lots of different opinions at lots of different stages along the way and still arrive at a very thoughtful and balanced decision. The risk you create there is the perception that you're siding with one party or another. Later on tonight, we'll talk about a code of ethics and how important it is for a board to do everything it can to prevent the perception of inappropriate behavior. And so I'll cycle back in closing on this case study by saying, even in that first moment when you're in the grocery store aisle, you want to, as much as take care of this person, you want to be clear with them what your role is and how the system works. Not to be cold and callous about it, but to be reinforcing the way the system was thoughtfully put together and is ideally structured for them. So were you to spend 15 minutes in the grocery store aisle, any number of people in the community are going to observe that, and it's not unlikely that people might come to the conclusion that this board member is really sympathetic to person X, Y, or Z's concern and is likely to take their side in an issue. Perception is much harder to control, and so you have to do everything you can to convey that kind of objectivity. So that's why we use this case study, because in some respects it's the most commonplace interaction for a board member to have, and at the same time it conveys an enormous amount of the message about who the board is and what their role is in this system. So I can imagine there might be some final comments. I do want to move us along, but if there's anything we haven't touched on at all, I do want to pause just to check on that, and then we'll take the next step. So anything that we haven't touched on at all in our discussion so far related to this case study, obviously. Okay. Hearing none, and should something occur to you later, probably most best way to communicate that would be to type a question or a comment and send it to me. Okay, so I want to step back. I've actually done this a few times through the discussion of that initial case study, but summarize more broadly how we describe the role of the board. So there are two terms in this opening phrase I want to highlight. One is trustee and the other is oversight. The community fundamentally is putting their trust in you, and you are responsible for three things, which all would fall under the broad term oversight. Number one, the high quality of education for every student. And I want to emphasize every student here. Number two, that the public gets a good return on its investment. Your taxpayers, the citizens in your community are investing both financially, and that's one of the critical responsibilities you have. They're obviously investing in other ways as well. So trust, return on investment, good quality education, and that finally the system overall, which includes the board, operates efficiently, effectively, and ethically. And I had touched on that notion of the perception of how important it is to cultivate the trust of the community by not allowing perceptions of favoritism or bias for the board to be viewed that way. Now, I want to take a further step back because many board members, many board members, I think, join their local board without knowing a great deal about the supervisory union. In some cases, maybe not knowing about the supervisory union at all. Our system of supervisory unions, and this is not true for every board in the state, there are some school districts, such as the Burlington School District, that is governed by a single board. But I believe everybody on the line tonight is a member of the supervisory union, and in so being, you are a member of a board which is also a member of a union of boards. Essentially, this calls us to be accountable, to think about our responsibilities across a wider region, so not limited by the boundaries of our town. Of course, it would be impossible to touch on that issue without briefly commenting on the discussion at the State House regarding our governance structure and the discussion about the reconfiguration of governance, ultimately for the purpose of delivering the best quality education we can to every child in the state. Tonight's session is not intended to go there particularly, but obviously there's some direct connections, and so I want to, at the very least, acknowledge that and say I trust and hope that you've received good information from us regarding the evolution of that discussion. I know some of you actually on the webinar are probably very intimately connected to this, but suffice to say that the idea of a supervisory union is both our current structure and the subject of much discussion in the legislature currently. In any case, what I want to emphasize here is, what I want to talk about is how supervisory unions can function effectively given our responsibilities for education of all children across the region. It's really built on the close working relationship of the board and the superintendent, and we've coined this term mutual accountability between the superintendent and all member boards. So it's a critical responsibility to be aware of, and a layer that I will refer to as we go through tonight's session. So I want to pause for a moment here and find out if there's anything that you came tonight particularly wanting to learn about or reference you might be looking for, And so I just want to pause and ask you either to comment or send me a message here in the question box. In answer to this question, what do you want to learn, or what do you want to make sure you take away by 7:30? So I'm going to pause for a moment for that purpose. And Carrie, actually I was going to ask for your help because I've lost the control panel on my screen and how to get that back.
This is Sherry Macri again. I guess I'll ask the question, or would you prefer it written in the question box?
No, go ahead and ask the question. You know, it helps the webinar feel a little bit less anonymous to actually have people talking at times. So why don't you go ahead and ask, and other people can as well. If it gets too drawn out, maybe I'll nudge us toward writing.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, I guess, related to the Vermont open meeting. Being a brand new school board member, I guess I want a clear understanding of communication amongst members. You know, what's okay, what's not okay, when can we talk, when can we not talk. Being on a 3-member board, as soon as I speak with any other board member, it's a quorum. So is that completely not okay, or are there parts of that that are okay? I just want a little better understanding of that.
Okay, we will talk in a little bit more detail about that. The quick answer is you're very limited on the 3-member board. But we'll come back to that later. Anything else, just so I make sure we touch on your questions tonight? Okay. Again, if you have other questions or comments, you can certainly send them through the text or the question box. This next slide is really a bit of a table of contents for the rest of our session. It's also the table of contents for the resource guide I mentioned. So I'm not going to spend more time with all the language here, but just as a point in time to say, okay, here are the other areas we'll cover. In some respects, we've touched on a few of these. Okay, so at the top of that list was engage the community and build a vision, and this is where I begin to make the case of how much important work boards have to do to prioritize in terms of their meeting time, let alone their thinking and interacting. So if you're going to serve as trustees for this community, if you're going to provide true oversight, you really need to have a sense of what you're trying to accomplish. And my experience with board members is there are probably many reasons why board members volunteer their service, and many of them are driven by what it is you want for the students, whether they're your own children or the children of your community. And so I want to use this exercise as a way to think broadly and long term, and then to try to attach that very quickly back to what does the board do with respect to these aspirations, these visions, goals, outcomes. I mean, there are any number of terms. So if you would, just give some thought to these two questions, and then I'm going to, maybe we'll ask 2 or 3 people to chime in. You may have a long list of things that you want your students to know and be able to do, and whether you think about that at kindergarten or grade 5 or high school graduation, what rises to the top of the list for you? And then in pairing that answer with what does the school board do if that's what this organization is intended to, is setting out to accomplish? What's the school board's role in that effort? So I want to nudge, maybe if we could hear from 2 or even 3 people, what came to the top of your mind here and how you connected those broad aspirations with specific responsibilities of the board. Well, I'm not hearing anybody, which I hope is well. So I'm going to just do a little putting people on the spot for a moment. You're welcome to pass or appeal for a lifeline if you'd like. Let's see. And I'm not really sure who all has been chiming in already. So given that, Jenny, are you still on the line?
I am.
So what came to the top? What's one thing that comes to the top of your list when you think about what you want your students to know and be able to do?
I feel like I'm so new to this that I really can't answer that effectively, but obviously to provide the best education and the highest level of education, the quality should be, you know, of a high level to succeed in life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let me. I want to try to get more specific. Can I push you a little bit further here? So, if you were, I don't know if you have your own children and if they're in school, but if there were a skill that you wanted to make sure every child graduated from high school with, what might one of those skills be?
I am just drawing a huge blank. I have to pass.
All right. Well, I'm glad you used that to demonstrate that it's available. And I can certainly provide some answers, but I think it's helpful maybe if it starts with. So, Shauna, looks like you actually have your hand raised, which is another option on this software. Do you have something you'd like to chime in with?
Yeah, I have young children, second and third grade, and you know, just their reading and writing skills are so important. Our school and has a new second grade teacher this year, and he has done so much work with the children on their writing, whether it be information or fictional writing or just, you know, writing in general. And I think that is so important. Just from my professional life, the number of communications that I get that I want to edit and send back.
Mm-hmm.
I think just that writing and grammar piece is so important, and you know, we obviously want to teach our children to be critical thinkers, and you know, just understanding how problem solving works and things like that. So I think those are important skills that we need to incorporate into our children's daily lives.
That's great. Thank you for chiming in. Can I stick with you for a moment more here and ask, what do you understand to be the board's role in the effort to, you talked about reading and writing and really good mechanics and communication skills broadly. You also talked about thinking and problem solving skills. In either of those scenarios, maybe, what does the board do to make those things happen for students?
I'm relatively new to the board as well, but I would expect that the board's role is a support role, an enabling role to help the school develop the programs, point them in the direction that they should be focusing, and let them find the path.
Great. Yeah, I think that's well put. That's a good general answer. So I'm going to build off that, and if somebody else wants to chime in, you know your options. So again, trying to start to connect the dots here. Okay, if you're serving the entire community, you have the responsibility to educate every child to a high level, and the community trusts that you're going to accomplish these things. You're going to build that trust by somehow engaging with them, you know, being part of the community conversations, to define what is it that we want for our kids. Now, of course, much of that is in place. I mean, we have very thoughtful curricula in our schools. We have years of experience delivering experience of all kinds for our students. So it's not as though you're inventing this from you know, step one, but there are many instances in which it's critical for the community to understand what is happening in our schools and why is this important. And keep in mind that the majority of your citizens do not have children in your school at any given time. So while you can rely on the day-to-day life of your school to keep parents informed, there are more people in your community that don't have children in the school, and they are taxpayers as well as citizens in the broadest terms. So there's this responsibility to let people know what it is you're doing, why it's important, and some of that is developed in conversation with the community. So should you, as really when we have these conversations with communities, the outcomes, the aspirations people have for our children are quite common, and many of the things that you just touched on, good communication skills, particularly reading and writing, broad thinking and problem-solving skills. This is language that we hear across the state. And then when I asked, okay, so what does the board do to make sure that happens, I wrote the note, so support. You have a support role. So I want to define that a little bit more specifically. Yes, support. You're not the ones teaching reading and writing. You're not the ones deciding on what curricular resources to invest in or what programs to employ. But you are the ones that need to say loud and clear, here are the things that we want for all of our children. And furthermore, we need evidence. We need to know that we're making progress. We may not be there yet, but what's the data? What is the information that we're going to hear and see and experience ourselves as board members that will give us confidence that this system is operating effectively and it's moving us toward these aspirations and goals? And while everything can't, I love that quotation that not everything that can be measured is important, and not everything important can be measured. While I think that's a truism, as a public body responsible for overseeing the operations of your public school system, you do need to declare very clearly the things you expect and how those are going to be measured. It won't cover everything that's important, but there are lots of dynamic and creative ways to collect information on how you're doing. We'll touch a little bit further on what we call monitoring, which is really this task of being thoughtful about collecting good data. But I want to link these two things, these two questions, so that I underscore the fact that the board's job is to define where you're going, and obviously that's in discussion with not just the citizens of your community, but the professional educators of your community, who are really, the most informed and engaged participants in this work. To together define where you're going, and together develop means for measuring progress. Now, there certainly are some means for measuring progress that you're required to carry out, and those provide critical pieces of information. When I talk about monitoring a little later on, I really want to make the case that what we currently use for monitoring, we can expand what we currently use for monitoring to really tell the story in a even more compelling way than we are currently.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
When you use the word monitoring and you're kind of using the term goals and visions for your students, it brings me to a question about numbers of schools or supervisory unions that are actually using the policy governance model, whether that's something that's used by many or not. I don't know the answers, so I don't know why. Would you as a presenter here introduce that as a question to us, who uses that and who doesn't on your school board now? The other thing is just, are you, when you're talking about goals for achievement of what we all want our students to learn, are you talking about the ends that we may have as a school board or a district come up with for our students, and then work to monitor and figure out and collect data for. I'm just kind of, those are the thoughts that are running through my mind right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So briefly, and other people can and please should chime in. Policy governance is a very effective structure for governing well. It's not the only practice that supports good governance. The School Boards Association supports and provides resources and training for boards that do use the methodology called policy governance. And obviously we support boards that use what we would call good governance, and the truth of the matter is the two are almost entirely aligned. So I guess I would say it's a good resource. Boards are at different places with respect to knowing about, being interested in, and employing what's called policy governance, which is fundamentally a comprehensively structured methodology for good governance. And yes, some of the language in our book and in my presentation tonight are terms that policy governance uses as well. So I hope that was what the question was. Okay. All right. And if other people want to chime in on that question, please do. All right. So again, following the conversation, there's a summary slide, and again, I think we've touched on these areas. I want to pull them up here to just briefly comment, but really reinforce the message about how important it is to be engaged with your community. In many respects, you need their assent to move forward. I mean, the most tangible, most concrete example of that is the community votes on your budget, and the budget is a very clear demonstration of what's important to you. It's where you're putting your financial resources. We talk a lot about systems built on personalization and proficiency. The idea that's now included in law, last year the legislature passed a law to create, which requires all students beginning in grade 7 to have what's called a personal learning plan. It's Act 77. And essentially it says every student will follow a unique path through their educational experience, and our system should both help the student develop that path and provide the opportunities and supports and resources to get there. And this is a very requires a great deal of engagement from the school personnel. It also requires a great deal of engagement from the broader community, and so it reinforces the importance of the board developing a trusting relationship with the community to build this vision, to work toward these common ends. And the final point here is the idea that the boards, again, represent the needs of all students, which is probably the most critical calling for boards to keep a focus on. All right. I talked about the importance of the working relationship between the boards and superintendent when I mentioned the supervisory union structure that we have in Vermont. The board, and by board in this case I'm talking about the supervisory union board, is the body that hires, works with, evaluates the superintendent and his or her performance as a way of keeping a close eye on the entire system. So that's why we use this phrase, hire a superintendent to provide leadership and to manage the district. It's a very rich and complex role that we ask superintendents to take up. Before going further into this case study, I just want to provide a 1-minute history lesson regarding the supervisory union. There are some estimates that 120, 150 years ago, so at the late 1800s, before the turn of the century, there might have been as many as 3,000 schools in Vermont. One-room schoolhouses, very small facilities that were extraordinarily localized as a result of the ability to travel and obviously the commitment to educate all students. Late in the 1800s, there was a decision to consolidate those schools. Technology had made travel more feasible, and there was a recognition that while there was richness in that great diversity of schools, that we needed to better guarantee that all students were given an adequate and equitable and we now talk about high quality education. And the mechanism for accomplishing that was to establish supervisory unions, which were fundamentally circuits that an individual supervisor could travel over a reasonable course of time to provide support, training, development opportunities for those teachers who were still largely on their own or in very small schools. So that's where the superintendency was originated. As you can imagine, and as is evidenced by our current practice, many management responsibilities were centralized at the superintendent's office over time because it offered an efficient way to accomplish those responsibilities. So that's a very quick sketch, and again relates to some of the discussion regarding in the legislature regarding governance. But as much as it might be a topic to dig into, I'm going to again keep that to the side of our agenda. So let me bring up the next slide, which is the next case study, and again ask you to read through this to yourself and think through these first three questions, and then I'll just prompt people to begin responding in a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to invite people's responses. I do want to take a small shortcut here and say, in response to question 3 about the role of the board, the superintendent, and the principal relative to one another, we did touch on that in the context of handling complaints that came out of the first case study. So we may touch on that again, although I think it's been summarized at this point. My question to you then is to focus on or my request to you is to focus on those first 2 questions and just hear, who do you think should have called the board chair in the first place? So in other words, what's the line of communication here, and how do you think it should work? So I'll probably call on 1 or 2 people unless there's anybody that wants to chime in here to start with. I think it's Sherry. Can you hear me? Are you on the line? And can you give us some thoughts here?
Sure. I believe that it probably should have been the principal who should have called the board chair to give her a heads up. And also, again, the principal who's responsible for running a safe and well-organized school.
Yeah, and I think those, in sort of combining your answer there or attaching those 2 together, I think you're conveying what I think is a appropriate understanding of roles. That really the principal is in charge of the building. Carrie, I'm getting a feedback loop so I can hear myself through the...
Oh, okay. Should I turn the speakers down?
Please do. I think
Okay.
that's what's causing the feedback.
Okay, that's better. I hope everybody can still hear me. So I was commenting that by linking your answer there, I think you're capturing a clear understanding. Yes, the principal is in charge of running that building day to day and all the mechanics that occur there. The most direct line of communication then would be from the principal to the board chair. In fact, that is the way it works in some places. However, as a legal structure, the superintendent is overall responsible for the operations of this entire system. And so this would be another area I would underscore how important it is for boards, well, leadership teams, so to discuss this, to make an informed decision about how communication would flow and to follow that. Because again, the law lays out clearly, and actually let me bring up this next slide to provide this illustration. In law, it's very clear that the board oversees, right? And we've touched on visioning, and we'll come back to some of these other terms. And then the board directly supervises the superintendent. I made reference to the supervisory union board. In statute, the description of the superintendent's role is as educational leader and chief executive officer for the district. That means the local board, and accountable to the supervisory union board and all member boards. So they essentially have multiple supervisors, a superintendent does, and that superintendent oversees the principal. So this is the clear hierarchy of responsibility, and in reverse order, the sequence of accountability. So in a pure structure, information would flow right back up this channel. That said, there are any number of reasons for communication to go directly from a principal to a board chair, and I'm just going to underscore that that's a conversation and decision that the leadership team should make together, obviously exploring both the benefits and pitfalls, and then follow whatever decision it is that they choose. The reality in Vermont is we have supervisory unions that are made up of 2 towns that are small and close together, such as Northfield and Roxbury in Washington South, Washington, the southern end of Washington County. We have supervisory unions at the northern end of our state and the southern end that have as many as 12 towns and as many as 13 boards. You can imagine that running all that information through the superintendent before it gets to the board chair works better and not as well based on those kinds of variables. So again, it's really a critical discussion for the board or for the leadership team to have. So I do want to summarize again a few items here related to what makes a supervisory union function effectively. Number 1 is that idea of being committed to all students across the region. Number 2, developing and cultivating that trusting relationship with the superintendent. And 3, having explicit understandings on all these items we just talked about, communications in particular. All right, there are 3 areas I would like to talk through, and then we'll come to one last case study. Policy has been referred to in several instances, again, in the opening case study. We talked about the chain of command and sometimes called the handling complaints. Policy is the board's opportunity to document what it wants to accomplish. Could be setting parameters, it could be describing broad goals, but it's also critical that it conveys the fact that the board's job is oversight and not management of the day-to-day operations, or not micromanagement. So I want to read this next slide as a way of characterizing generally what we see as appropriate policy. When we speak about school board policy, we speak about ideas with the power to set directions for the school system, to bring about prudent action by the administration, the staff, and the board itself. A soundly constructed policy will tell the administration enough so that it can get working on the task in accordance with the board's wishes. So this language is taken from the National Association of School Boards. We feel like it provides a very concise summary of what the nature of policy is in an effective governance model. And again, everything from a vision statement is a type of policy to, well, a chain of command, which is a more mechanical type of policy, to a job description for a superintendent, to an evaluation process for a superintendent. These are all essentially policy documents because they provide that broad direction and guide both the entire organization, which includes the action of the board. A couple other notes on policy. Number one, we say know your policies. Now, in the model policy manual that we publish on our website, there I think are now 55 or 56 policies, which is actually a stark contrast with some policy manuals which run to the hundreds of pages. But even with a policy manual that may only have 50 to 60 policies, I don't think our point is that you should know these policies word for word. The point is to understand how they're organized, what their purpose is, and how to access them and use them in your work as a board. There certainly are times and places where the board should be referring to its policy, and this is actually a practice, just to connect a few more dots here, that's central to policy governance, is that use of policy in thinking through any particular situation that the board is addressing. So we talk about knowing policies and some resources that can enable boards to be, comfortable with their policies, and then following those policies. Sometimes I think I shouldn't include that bullet point, but it's obviously a critical reminder that these declarations of intent and practice, which we call policy, are there after much thoughtful discussion and decision making. And so as a board member, your obligation is to follow those policies. It's not to say that policies don't evolve and change over time, but to say that those that are in place should be followed. All right. As I go through these three sections, it's policy, budgeting, and monitoring. I trust if you have some comments or questions, you'll write them, raise your hand, or just chime in along the way. Budgeting. There are two dimensions to budget work that I want to talk about. One is this idea of looking forward and developing a budget, and the other is, I guess it's not really looking backwards, but it's looking carefully at your management of existing resources, at your existing budget. So let's take the big picture first. Along the same lines that we started with defining broad outcomes or vision, the budget is one of the most concrete ways in which you convey what's important. Where you put the financial resources of your organization is probably the most clear expression of what's important to you. And so with that in mind, we highly recommend boards approach the budgeting process in a way that looks at the big picture. So in other words, as you enter the budget conversation, which is typically in the fall, the first conversation ought to be about what is it we're trying to accomplish? What is our vision? What are our highest priorities in terms of specific goals for this year? That kind of information is critical for the superintendent and his or her management team to know in shaping a budget. So I often use arts and technology as two examples here. If the arts are an important dimension of what you want all your students to experience and become skilled or at the very least acquainted with, then your budget needs to reflect that. Similarly, technology is a good example to play out because it's both tangible, as in hardware and software, computers and other devices, and it's intangible. It's professional development and curriculum development and integration into classes. If you're going to declare that these things are important, then they ought to be conveyed in the budget development process. Now, I will touch on this a little bit more under monitoring. You also want to make sure that you've established clear measures for whether those dollars are getting you the results you set out to achieve. But let's come back to that in a moment. So budgeting with your vision in mind, conveying to in the early process of development what's important and that should be reflected in the budget. The corresponding responsibility you have is to make sure those dollars are being spent ethically, legally, appropriately, effectively. And so it's critical that you have good information about how your management system is working, that information is shared in a way that makes sense to the board, and this does not mean that you need to be a expert in financial management. In fact, probably one of the most effective filters that a board provides the organization is the requirement that information like financial management be conveyed in a way that makes sense to any and every citizen. So making sure you look long-term in developing your budget, making sure you look short-term in the appropriate expenditure of those resources. Those are the two components I want to touch on. Now, I want to highlight one or two other items. Essentially, those first two bullet points about ensuring the financial house is in order is what I was saying about oversight. That's what enables you to keep your emphasis on the big picture, holding people accountable, being clear about whose role and responsibility or how those play out in the system, and that you're operating as efficiently as possible. And here's the challenge. I often hear boards say something like, we only have control over 10 or 12 or 15% of the budget, or maybe it's 20%. The rest of it's already in place. It's salary and benefits. Here's the challenge. There's nothing in law currently that requires you to have a certain staffing level. There's nothing in Vermont state statute that says for every 15 students you have to have one teacher or a staff person. So it is a question that boards ought to challenge themselves to ask. And in a similar fashion, I think boards experience the special education budget as entirely separate and delivered to them in a black box that they don't get to ask any questions about. And as a result, often are frustrated. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that boards start digging into individual education plans and making modifications that would affect the budget. I am, however, struck by the information that we presented at our fall conference a year ago when we looked at the variation across districts, equating them for the number of special education students and the types of needs that were represented there, and knowing that there's no exact comparison there's no exact comparison whenever you take two people. So what we noticed was there was a dramatic difference among districts in terms of the number of special education staff that they employed. Now, I'm not leaping to the conclusion that that in and of itself is a problem. It simply raised our awareness to say we ought to ask some questions. There ought to be some opportunity with every part of the budget, special education included, where the board can ask critical questions to understand what results are we getting, what are the outcomes that we're looking for with this special education budget, and similarly, when I mentioned monitoring, what information will we get over the course of the year that conveys to us that we're getting those outcomes that we invested this money to accomplish. So those are prompts or challenges in a sense that we really want boards to take up through the budgeting process. And finally, this idea that it may be, we call it joint ventures and mergers. Again, obviously this is connects to some of the discussion in the legislature currently about how our systems are organized. There's already in law and in precedent examples where communities have come together to create joint schools, essentially create one school out of two. And these are ways in which boards can look creatively at the budgeting process to not feel as though their hands are tied and they only have access to a very small percentage of the budget. Just a comment about this final bullet that budget development and management is year-round work. Budgets don't go in a purely linear fashion, so while you're in the midst of fiscal year 14, which will come to an end on June 30th, you are also probably getting final reports, or I'm not sure when exactly boards will receive audits from fiscal year 13, but that budget sort of work is not completely finished until you've received your external audit and you've addressed the recommendations that were identified. So both the previous year and the current year are in motion, and really the kinds of conversations that we've touched on tonight ought to suggest that there should be some thinking already about fiscal year 15. This is a budget that the board will work on beginning in the fall, and there are any number of conversations that you're having now or data that you're looking at that should be giving you good information to consider in the development of the next year's budget. So budgets are in a sense cycling, they're overlapping and cycling through more than one at a time. All right, I've promised a little bit more on monitoring, so I want to add a few thoughts here. I think this opening slide is the rationale, which we've talked about in many ways. It's about assuring accountability for the results. This is really a similar pair of questions to what we talked about when we looked at vision and, sorry, the ringing phone just distracted me for a moment there. So when we looked at vision and the board's role in making progress toward that vision, it's really another way of asking those types of questions. You know, if things were happening ideally, if our system was operating efficiently, how would we know? What evidence would we collect? What would we be seeing? And this is a prompt at the bottom of the screen to say it's both about student learning and operational efficiencies, that broad category under return on investment. So the top three bullet items on this list are the data points that we are most familiar with and turn to most frequently in our current operations. So in particular, standardized test scores tend to take a lot of our attention and focus. What I want to suggest is that our work really is more around the next three bullet items. What are the measurements that we want to use to say, on a more local basis, that say this is really what we want for our students? So for instance, although there is certainly effort now with the Common Core to measure thinking and problem solving, that hasn't historically been the case with the standardized testing that we use. Furthermore, even the Common Core curriculum itself is established in only some academic areas and not in areas like citizenship and creativity and artistic expression and teamwork and any number of other values that we often hear communities talk about when they talk about what they want their students to know and be able to do. There's an enormous range of opportunity to capture information, and it includes things like seeing students perform in the arts, on the athletic field, in the academic disciplines. So it's a prompt for boards to think creatively and broadly about what are all the ways in which we can collect good information and tell the story about what we're accomplishing and fulfill our responsibility to monitor progress in this system. The bottom bullet point is just a reminder that one of the most effective tools you have for monitoring is your financial reports, both the monthly, year-end, and then I had also mentioned the audit. One more case study. So again, take a minute to read this through and think to yourself about these 3 questions, and then we'll pull our thoughts together and finish up with one last section. So I'm not by any means on top of who's chimed in along the way here. I trust everybody's taken the opportunity, should they want it. To a certain extent, as I said at the outset, I put people on the spot a little bit because many of these situations are going to happen in unpredictable ways. So the training serves as a glimpse into some of those dynamics. But since we're near, since this is our last section, I'll just invite some comments from anybody that's ready. And let's start with the first question. Do you have an obligation to do something about this?
Yeah, I think you do.
I think you do too.
That's Jackie. I think you need to have a conversation as a board about what the board thinks the board member should do in this situation, possibly recusing her or himself from this. But I guess it's a conversation that the board should have. That's my, I guess.
Yes. I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. I will say that one of the required policies is a conflict of interest policy, which says very specifically that a board member cannot vote on a question from which they would receive benefit through a contract or agreement, I think is the phrase exactly. So that's spelled out very clearly in statute. However, really the questions that are here are not addressed in law specifically. So do you have an obligation? Yes, you do. And I would describe it largely under the category of perception. It might well be that this bus driver, and I've heard comments like, well, they might have great information that no one else on the board would have about bus companies and transportation, and if they weren't part of the discussion, you know, we wouldn't have that good information. I think that's an entirely valid point. However, if this person even takes part in the discussion, it would be, I think, a quite natural perception for anybody else watching the board have this discussion to conclude that that individual in that bus company was getting preferable treatment. So again, it's a cautionary note about being especially vigilant not to give any even perception that that you're allowing a conflict of interest to play out on the board and influence the board's decision. So there are multiple strategies that board members employ here. You do have an obligation. You know, one method would be to go to talk to the board member directly. Another method would be to talk to the board chair and ask him or her to address this with the board member in question, who's also a bus driver. If neither of those took place, then it could simply be a comment made in the board meeting that, you know, you've become aware of a potential conflict of interest regarding the bus contract and think that the board really needs to make sure it's not vulnerable to that risk or that perception. And ideally, obviously, the bus driver would either acknowledge this or, even better, you know, let people know ahead of time and remove him or herself from the discussion and obviously the voting on this. And essentially that's what we recommend be conveyed to the community member, that the board operates under a code of ethics that requires people to avoid a conflict of interest or the perception thereof, and that as a board you'll take this up in a way that complies with that policy. So it is a critical one, again, to build that trust and faith in the community. So I'm going to move us on, except I see that Aaron, you have your hand raised, so I think actually I can unmute you. How's that? Aaron, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah. How does conflict of interest apply as a parent? Many of us probably have kids in the school system. I can give a specific example. Our board is looking at introducing public preschool, and I have a child who would be eligible. So when do you step away from the discussion, or do you need to when it comes to your children?
Yeah. So this is that area where I would say operating as transparently as possible is really critical. It's often the case that, you know, a parent who's a board member wants to be a parent and should be first and foremost. So whether it's in meeting with an individual teacher or taking part in volunteer activities at the school or being involved in a discussion about preschool, parents ought to declare their position or, you know, their potential conflict, and the board ought to come to terms with how are we going to deal with this? I mean, I suppose it's possible on a 3-member board that if you had 2 people that had children in preschool, you know, you'd be faced with a dilemma of what to do. I don't have an easy answer to something like that, except to say you need to put that on the table openly and transparently for the board to discuss and come to a decision about how it's going to proceed. And parents who are board members need to be particularly vigilant about any and all of those situations. And I'll just use one example here. For some people in the school building, when a board member walks in, it's you know, it feels like evaluation, and so it's really critical for board members to declare and be really transparent about why they're in the building and what they're doing. And I'm not suggesting, you know, you need to call together a staff meeting and describe this, but a lot of that can be effectively conveyed by staying in your role. So if you're there to volunteer, you go in and you do your volunteer work, and you know, you don't get into conversations with staff members in the hall that might be perceived as complaint sessions, or who knows. I mean, you can imagine the potential pitfalls, and so the simplest answer is operate transparently, make that sort of the ethical practice of your board. I hope that answers your question. The last thing I'll say by way of answering it is I recently had a superintendent describe a situation where a parent had an interest in a discussion at the board and literally left the board table to join the audience for the discussion. Well, so, you know, in terms of transparency, it was certainly an effective way to convey, I'm not involved in this as a board member because I want to speak as a parent. I think I mentioned, one of my constant refrains is talk this through as a board, come to a decision, and uphold whatever it is you decide.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for good questions all along the way here. I'm going to bring these up as our summaries again and make a few comments. I did mention this code of ethics, which we highly recommend boards use as an exercise to talk through these kinds of issues and sign to symbolically demonstrate their commitment. A couple of these comments are ways of conveying the character of how boards need to present themselves. So this comment, no legal powers outside the board. Boards have power as a body, not as individual board members, and so it's important that board members not give the impression that they have powers outside of a board meeting. Board members assure that schools are well run but don't run them harkens back to even our first case study, which is that idea that boards should fulfill their role and in so doing reinforce the functioning of the entire school system. This last few bullets will touch on open meeting law, which I know came up earlier. Open meeting law, among other things, requires board meetings to be held in public. It does not require board meetings to be meetings of the public. These are board meetings held in public. One of the required components of open meeting law is a public comment period. Typically it's the first 10 minutes of the agenda. That is designed to provide the community an opportunity to give the board information that they might not otherwise have. It's one of the more challenging dimensions of a board meeting to run, particularly if and when people are unhappy or come with concerns. Obviously, there's more to it than just the letter of the agenda. These are your fellow community members, and so there are relationships to take care of. That said, drawing that line for people in the community that public comment is time for the board to hear information. It may well inform an agenda item either on that evening's agenda or become a subsequent agenda item, but we highly recommend it not become a discussion item. And so there's some guidelines in our resource manual for designing agendas that we believe convey those boundaries and help boards follow them. The other items I want to touch on, I did mention executive session earlier on. There are 7 and only 7 reasons to enter executive session, and not only do we recommend boards use that language precisely, but the Secretary of State weighed in on a school board scenario where essentially he made that an even more clear expectation. So again, that language is in our resource manual, and the final component of the section on open meeting law is about how public records are kept. There is language in there about both electronic communications, which in short should be one-way communications of information, not a forum for discussion. Although there is also discussion in the legislature this year about modifying open meeting law, taking into consideration the current realities of electronic communications. So that may evolve. And with respect to the question about communication amongst board members outside of board meetings, the simple answer is you shouldn't do that certainly on a 3-member board, because 2 people represent a quorum of the board. On larger boards, it's probably commonly practiced and can be appropriate. Again, I would offer or add the caution that you need to do everything you can not to create the perception that decisions are being discussed outside of a board and being brought to the board or something along those lines. Now, I'm a little over time. I want to add one final 1 or 2 minute section and then close. So I hope people can stay with me for a few extra minutes.
Excuse
me.
I have to sign off, so I'm really...
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as you sign off, you'll receive the evaluation, so if you can take a moment with that. And I will hold myself to 2 more minutes here. I want to add a comment about negotiations. So what I am bringing up here is the full cycle of tonight's session with contract negotiations in the middle. Really what we want to draw people's attention to, it's one thing to generate this cycle of good governance if it conflicts with the boundaries of your negotiated agreements. It's an extraordinarily frustrating process. So what we are encouraging boards to do is to go to the negotiation table with a conversation. Really about these big questions about what do we want for students and what that means for our schools, what it means for teaching profession, and why these things are important. The boards that have pursued this have found it to be a significantly different discussion, and so while it hasn't yielded all of the changes they might have set out to accomplish, it has been extraordinarily promising. So this slide simply summarizes the characteristics of what we're calling a 21st century bargaining process, sometimes called interest-based bargaining, and I would refer you to our website for further information on that. So this is the last slide I wanted to have up here so people see other training opportunities that are coming up in the calendar. As you sign off tonight, you'll receive a 3-question evaluation, and again, any feedback would be appreciated. So thank you very much. I thought it worked well, and people chimed in with really helpful comments and questions. We'll send all this to you, and should you have other questions or comments, please get in touch with us by email or phone. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.